It's great to be with you to talk about Christian nationalism. My name's Peter Lynas. I'm the UK Director of the Evangelical Alliance. And one of the things about that role is getting to travel right around the UK, probably every year, sitting down with 400 to 500 different church leaders and hearing some of what they're experiencing. So it's partly that I bring. I was trained as a lawyer, studied my theology in Regent College in Vancouver, and bring those together with a real passion for advocacy and faith in the public square. So I want to look a little bit at Christian nationalism, and I do that as somebody who comes from Northern Ireland, a place of flags and marches, of contested identities, political violence, a very deep historical memory, where religion and politics have so often been blended together to the degree that people often don't even notice. And so Protestant and Catholic were not simply theological categories where I grew up. They became attached to political loyalties, constitutional aspirations, neighbourhoods, schools, cultural identities. And religion really shaped so much of who somebody was. And once faith fuses with territory and identity and power, compromise becomes difficult. Political disagreement no longer feels merely political, it feels existential. Flags become sacred, marches become sacred, memory becomes sacred. And so being from Northern Ireland, I actually really believe these conversations are important, and because questions around Christian nationalism really do go to issues of discipleship and identity and fear and belonging and allegiance. But when we talk about Christian nationalism, one of the big issues is, what do we mean by Christian nationalism? Sometimes it simply means conservative Christians who become involved in politics. Sometimes it's a synonym for patriotism. Sometimes it's little more than a political insult that's thrown at others. And so clarity really matters in this. There are lots of different definitions. Here is a working definition because it feels like it's always up for review. Christian nationalism is a political, cultural, a theological framework that seeks to fuse a nation's identity, civic life and public institutions with a very particular form of Christianity. So it's drawing on symbols and stories and narratives that portray the nation as fundamentally Christian in origin or destiny, and argues that laws, culture and public life should preserve those Christian values. And it often promotes preferential status for Christianity within state structures. It may include ethno-cultural understandings of nationhood, and it frames the nation's Christian identity as under threat. Now I would say that some of those features are agreed largely, and some are a little more contested, and it's worth noting those. It's largely agreed that the Christian nationalism is linked to a Christian origin story around the nation. The nation was fundamentally Christian, and that is something to which it must return. And that's linked to an anxiety about the nation's Christian character, that it's being lost, that it's being threatened. The idea of preferential status, I think, is again largely agreed, that Christianity should enjoy some sort of privileged position within public life and it's in the institutions of a nation. And then there's an aspect of codependency. Nick Spencer has talked about this. To properly belong, you need to at least assent to Christianity in some form. There's an overlap between Christian identity and national belonging. The degree of that is contested, as we'll see on the other side a little bit. So some of the more contested features are around whether there's an ethno-cultural understanding of nationhood. Is it a particular people group that God has ordained in this territory? There are low views of democratic freedoms, and again this is a little contested, that most will support the democratic process, but they will see in it a kind of instrumentalizing of state power in that moment, that it's useful to get their will and to enforce moral or religious ideas. So in that realm then, religious freedom is restricted to some degree because you're going to force others to go along with your nationalism, Christian nationalism in this case. And then there's an argument about the ideology piece. Is this a political ideology? Nationalism, with that ism on the end, is an ideology, I would say, and ideologies are driven often by idolatry, and that's where the codependency goes wrong. So that clarity is important, because being concerned for Britain's Christian heritage is not necessarily Christian nationalist. Wanting Christians to be involved in public life certainly shouldn't be. I hope we would all agree on that we should be. It's the issue of whether Christianity becomes fused with national identity in ways that distort the gospel, that exclude others. So we're continuing to unpack, okay, so what is Christian nationalism? We've got a working definition. We've seen some features that are agreed, some that are pushed back or contested. I think there are 4 orientations, and I've written more about this. You can get that at the EA website, eauk.org, but I've unpacked them a little here. So we've got these different orientations, and they're to do with Christianity and nationalism in 2 words, whether it's a big C or a small c, a big N, small n. So first we've got cultural Christian nationalism. I think this is a little more nostalgic. It's those who, the kind of 46, I think it is, % of our population who would tick the census box to be Christian, very culturally Christian, not practicing or attending church. And then we've got a strong, the nationalism again is small n. It's patriotic. It puts up the flags from time to time. It recognizes the significance of nation and country, but it's cultural overall. Then we have, secondly, confessional Christian nationalism, so big C, small n. Committed Christians, faith first, but they have a strong view about the nation, very patriotic, but that sits, it's Christianity leads them and is the dominant, and their national views or their patriotism sits under that and may flow from it. So I'd say they're confessional Christian nationalists. The third is classic Christian nationalism, big C, big N. So very explicit theological, political project. Christianity is not seen as just simply culturally important. It's fundamental to who the person is, to the state authority they think needs to come about, and then to the national destiny. So very strong on both. And then the fourth is co-opted Christian nationalism. Small c, cultural Christianity leading on this, but a big N, strong nationalism. So they'll take Christian symbolism, Christian language, Christian heritage, and use that as a tool for mobilization. Christianity is more about cultural branding than discipleship. I think the cultural Christianity is the biggest. You have a large amount of people who are culturally Christian, culturally pro the nation, up for that. But it is feeding into and is the easiest kind of jump across to the co-opted. And that's in people's minds right now. We've had local election results and election results in Scotland and Wales as well. And we've got Tommy Robinson marches coming up, and people are concerned, interested about the movement of politics towards the right, potentially the far right, and how they are leaning on a return to Christian values and some of that language and heritage and imagery to advance their cause. And the church needs to be alert to how that is being used. I also think it's worth noting we have 4 nations in the UK. I've indicated already that I come from Northern Ireland, one of those 4, and that the conversations around nationalism look different in England, in Scotland, in Wales, and in Northern Ireland. I think that reminds us that nationalism is not actually inherently right or left wing. So we might have in our minds that it's right wing, but actually the SNP and Plaid Cymru are strongly nationalist parties who would sit to the left of centre politically. Obviously Reform to the right. In Northern Ireland you have a split SDLP and nationalist parties, DUP and European Unionist parties. Very different even directions of nationalism in those parties within Northern Ireland. And so you see a nationalism that can express a healthy civic pride in somewhere like Scotland. That probably sits more obviously to us and we can recognise that, or Wales. But we can also see how it can become exclusionary, grievance-driven and authoritarian. And Northern Ireland reminds us of ways in which that can become deeply entangled and shape generations. I do think within that, and for this group, it's worth thinking about some of the theological streams that feed into nationalism. Nile Saya, sorry if I haven't pronounced that right, and Nick Spencer have both talked about this and identify some of these streams. The first, charismatic dominionism. So this is often associated with Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity, and particularly in the United States. It's called the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation. Again, that's a fairly amorphous group as to where the boundaries of that and who's in it. It tends to argue that Christians are called not only to save souls, but to take authority over institutions in society. You might have heard of things like the 7 Mountain Mandate. That Christians should reclaim these spheres for God. The political struggle is often framed as spiritual warfare for the nation that must be reclaimed for God. Now, some would see that as dominionist, and a kind of desire to go to battle and to conquer. For many other charismatics, they would see that as fulfilling the cultural mandate and reject that kind of dominionism and dominance. But you can think here people like Paula White-Cain, advisor to Donald Trump. You can think of Bethel and some of the movements around even the worship music in the UK. It actually has quite a significant influence, I think, on this conversation. You also then have the Reformed Reconstructionism, emerging from more conservative Calvinist theology. Thinkers such as Rushdoony, Reconstructionism or theocracy, arguing society should be built on biblical laws and explicitly Christian moral principles. It's more systematic, probably more intellectual than the previous group, influenced parts of the American Christian right in particular, homeschooling movement, Christian education, and advocating for a distinctly Christian legal order. So you think theocracy, sphere sovereignty in here. Somebody like Pete Hegseth, I think he's the defense secretary in the US, has been associated with this school. And again, the boundaries of these aren't always clear. So when I say people are associated with, it's because that's sometimes contested. And then thirdly, Catholic integralism. Again, argues that political authority should be orientated towards humanity's spiritual good, but that temporal power, the political state, should be subordinate to the spiritual power of the church, the Catholic Church. And it critiques secular neutrality, and that is really a myth, and liberal individualism, advocating for society shaped on Christian truth for the common good. More intellectual than populist, but it does seek ultimately the privileged role of Christianity within public life. You might think Patrick Deenan here, First Things, J.D. Vance. You can see I've already mentioned three people within Donald Trump's orbit, and you can see how they are from three different, arguably kind of theological streams informing or shaping them, and yet they can work together. And I think one of the interesting things we see here in the UK as well is people on some of these marches or around Christian nationalism are informed out of much more the charismatic tradition, some out of much more the kind of Reformed Calvinist, some out of the Catholic tradition. And although they theologically disagree on many things, interestingly, they can come together around some of these movements. And many aren't perhaps aware of entirely how that thinking has shaped them. I think it's also really worth us noting why Christian nationalism resonates. What are some key themes that is driving it? I would say that's issues around identity. So we need to acknowledge many people do feel culturally disorientated, communities feel fragmented, shared moral frameworks feel weaker, and people feel detached from place and history and belonging. And so Christian nationalism offers a powerful narrative. This is who we are, this is where we have come from, this is how we recover meaning, this is where we are heading. And it's emotionally compelling, particularly to those who are rootless, and in a time when pathways to express patriotism seem unclear. I would say in many ways it is a new form of identity politics. I would say to those on the left, you were playing identity politics. That wasn't helpful at times, and now you're being essentially outmatched by those on the right. And I would say to those on the right, you critique the left for their identity politics, and now you're reinventing it. It's like the emperor's new clothes on the other side. That is not a good idea, full stop. But we need to acknowledge some of our own past history in that and then challenge it. But what the shift is also, because this is no longer about political opinions, it is about political identities, and they often become idols. And then the challenge of that, of course, is you're no longer challenging somebody's opinion, which we should rightly be able to do. You're seen to be challenging their very identity. Now, we've done some polling within churches, and we know, for example, in our world, the Evangelical Alliance, 15% roughly are voting Green, 25% might be voting Reform. So in a church, you've got 40% of people who belong to political parties or vote for, engage with political parties that the other almost doesn't believe should exist, or certainly aren't Christian. So the level of disconnect and polarization is incredibly high on issues around identity. And secondly, I do think we've got problems or challenges around Islam. And people are anxious about the growth of that, about social integration, about religious change. And we need to be careful not to dismiss those anxieties too lightly. There are questions about integration and religious freedom. So one of my colleagues recently was at a Muslim-Christian dialogue, and I know some others of you here were at it. It took hours, 6-7 hours to work their way through a 3-page document. Why was that? Because this was respectful dialogue, that's good, but also there were profound and fundamental disagreements. We don't agree on significant areas as Muslims and Christians. These are two, I would describe them as totalizing faiths, in that they make exclusive and often mutually exclusive claims. And we need to acknowledge that. There's personal Islam, there is a public version of Islam and engagement around that, but there is also a political Islam that I would say is akin to Christian nationalism, and both of those must be addressed. And it's naive to just say, oh, more Muslims are coming here and all we need to do is evangelize them and witness to them. That is true, but that is not all of what we should be saying and engaging on this. We do have to resist the fear-driven narratives, we do have to resist the stereotyping, but we do also need to acknowledge the fundamental disconnect that we have, but also defend religious freedom for all, because that's a fundamentally Christian idea. And then immigration. There are concerns sitting below these conversations. I think Christians should be able to reasonably disagree on immigration policy. There are hard questions around borders, asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants, etc. There are questions of social trust. There are questions around borders and legislation on that. And Rowan Williams, I mean, hardly a figure of the far right, said in a recent interview with Unheard, in principle, it is morally acceptable to argue for greater immigration restrictions. And he said it's tough to talk about this, about sustainable immigration, because good policy necessarily leads to heartless moments. And so these are tough conversations. So we've got to resist the simplistic, everybody can come, there are no kind of borders, or a simplistic narrative built on fear and resentment. And the biblical challenge is to hold compassion and justice together. And Christian nationalism offers clarity and certainty and belonging, and it seems protection. And so we've got to be engaging, I think, realistically in these conversations, because these are the themes and tensions that are drawing people in. How do we respond? Well, look, let me just move the slide forward here, sorry. A couple of things. We need to acknowledge our own complicity. I think the church has often vacated the playing field in this area. Too often we've ignored tough questions around identity or immigration, etc. Look, we should be advocating for justice. We should be defending human dignity. We should be caring for the poor and the stranger. We should speak about the sanctity of life from conception until the end. We should be resisting abortion and assisted suicide. We should be strengthening marriage between a man and a woman, families, communities. We're wearing black today for this event to acknowledge violence against women and girls. And to do so, we must know what a woman is. And some may bristle at that and think I'm straying a little from the topic. But when the church can't address that kind of issue, other voices will, and they will speak with clarity where we should be. And so we need, with humility, to acknowledge some of our own blind spots. And in some church contexts, Christian nationalism is barely recognised or challenged in any way, shape or form. And in others, every expression of patriotism or cultural concern is treated with suspicion. We do need to understand, I think, too, the appeal of this, particularly to young men. We have seen many more young men coming to faith recently. Stats and the stories tell us that. But that is challenging sometimes. I know lots of people who've come to faith through Charlie Kirk's funeral or through Jordan Peterson and some of his teachings. I've met people who've been on the Tommy Robinson March, a new Christian who said his faith journey was mirroring Tommy Robinson's faith journey. And those conversations are really helpful and they are challenging. But it does require careful discipleship. We need to be engaging and recognising that young men are coming with these views. It's not a surprise that they lean right politically. Young men do more so than young women, but also it's the politics and the very people shaping that are bringing them to Christianity as well. So are we up for those kind of tough conversations sometimes, and those really engaging and challenging conversations? And finally, we do need to engage seriously. We don't want to retreat from public life. We don't want to withdraw. We do need to be tackling some of the root causes, and we do that well. Alienation, loneliness, loss of meaning, family breakdown, social fragmentation. We need to be better, I think, on the good citizenship and patriotism and the nation, responsibility and belonging and what that looks like. And we need to speak prophetically, not baptizing any political tribe, but challenging ideology where we see it. Because this isn't a political problem, it is a spiritual one. Our citizenship is in heaven, absolutely. And Christian nationalism is in danger at time of confusing the kingdom of God with the kingdoms of this world, as are other political ideologies. Let's be clear about that. If I've learned one thing from Northern Ireland, that you can have a society that is saturated in Christian language and still profoundly lacking in a deep love of Jesus. You can preserve the symbolism without producing Christ-like people. Christian nationalism is not new. It's an old temptation to sanctify the tribe, to seek security and power, and to confuse the gospel with political identity. We are called to a different way because our highest allegiance is not to tribe or territory, but to Christ. Be blessed.